There's a specific kind of pain that only exists after you become genuinely self-aware. A pain nobody warns you about when they tell you to know yourself. When they hand you the advice like it comes with no fine print attached. Before, you could make the same mistake and call it bad luck, a random misfortune with no author behind it. Now you watch yourself make it again in real time, fully conscious of the pattern, and somehow still unable to stop it from happening. Narrating your own repetition as it unfolds in front of you. This is a part of self-awareness nobody sells you in the personal development section, tucked quietly behind the promises of clarity and empowerment that dominate the conversation. We are not talking about the comfortable kind of self-knowledge today, the kind that fits neatly into a journal prompt and produces a satisfying insight before bed. The kind that feels good precisely because it stays shallow enough not to actually cost anything real from the person holding the pen. We are talking about the specific cost of seeing yourself clearly, a cost Carl Jung understood better than almost anyone who has ever written seriously about the psyche and its actual mechanics. He knew that awareness does not arrive gently, does not ease a person in slowly the way a warm bath might, easing muscles one at a time before asking anything difficult of them. It arrives as a kind of exposure, stripping away the comfortable ignorance that used to protect you from your own patterns. And once that ignorance is gone, it does not come back no matter how much you might, on certain difficult nights, genuinely wish it would return to you. So ask yourself honestly whether becoming more self-aware over these last few years has made your life simpler, or whether it has actually made certain things heavier in ways you rarely say out loud to anyone. Even people close to you who might actually understand if you gave them the chance. If it's the second one, you are not doing self-awareness wrong, and there is nothing broken in how you've approached this work. You are experiencing exactly what Jung predicted happens the moment a person actually starts looking at themselves directly instead of through the comfortable haze most people never actually leave in an entire lifetime. In the next few minutes, we walk through the real cause of this kind of clarity and what to actually do with it once you're standing inside it, rather than pretending the cause doesn't exist at all or waiting for someone else to name it for you first. Lesson 1. The death of a useful excuse. Before real self-awareness. Ignorance functioned as a kind of shield, however flimsy it actually was in practice. A person could hurt someone and genuinely not see the pattern behind it, could sabotage an opportunity and chalk it up to circumstance beyond their control, could repeat the same relationship mistake 3 separate times and experience each one as a fresh, unrelated tragedy rather than a chapter in a much longer book they hadn't yet learned to read. This ignorance was never comfortable exactly, but it did offer something genuinely valuable, a kind of innocence that made the pain bearable because it seemed random rather than authored by anyone in particular, least of all themselves. Jung understood that the unconscious operates precisely this way when left unexamined, generating behavior the conscious mind never has to take responsibility for, because it genuinely doesn't see the thread connecting one incident to the next, each one arriving as though for the first time. The moment real self-awareness arrives, that shield disappears permanently, and it does not come back on request no matter how badly a person might want the relief of not knowing again. A person who becomes aware of their own pattern of pulling away right when intimacy deepens can no longer experience the next instance of pulling away as something that simply happened to them, an event with no author. They watch themselves do it, often in real time, fully conscious of the mechanism as it activates, and the awareness itself becomes a kind of witness they cannot dismiss or argue with afterward, no matter how uncomfortable its testimony happens to be. Picture someone in the middle of a promising relationship who notices, with total clarity, the exact moment they start manufacturing a reason to create distance, recognizing the pattern from 3 previous relationships as it happens in real time, and still, despite seeing it with perfect precision, finding themselves unable to stop the momentum already in motion, watching the same ending arrive from a front row seat they never asked for. This is a specific grief self-awareness introduces that nobody mentions in a version of the concept sold as pure empowerment on a poster or in a quote graphic. You lose the excuse of not knowing permanently and without appeal, and what replaces it is not automatically the power to change, at least not immediately and rarely on the timeline anyone would actually choose. What replaces it at first is simply the discomfort of watching yourself clearly, again and again, before the capacity to act differently is actually caught up to the seeing. Lesson 2. The shadow arrives before you're ready to integrate it. Jung's most specific warning about self-knowledge involved exactly this timing problem, one that catches almost everyone off guard the first time they encounter it directly. Awareness of the pattern almost always precedes the actual capacity to change it, sometimes by months, sometimes by years, and the gap between seeing clearly and acting differently is one of the most disorienting stretches a person can move through, precisely because it looks from the outside like failure rather than an ordinary and expected phase. This gap gets misread constantly as failure, as evidence that the self-awareness itself was somehow fake or incomplete, when in reality it is simply the ordinary shape of how psychological change actually works beneath the surface, slower and less linear than anyone would prefer. The conscious mind can name a pattern with total accuracy, while the deeper structures that actually generate behavior remain, for a while, entirely unmoved by that naming, continuing to fire the old response regardless of how clearly it has been identified and labeled. Jung called the material surfacing, in this process the shadow. Everything a person is pushed into darkness because it was inconvenient or unacceptable at the time it originally formed. And the specific cruelty of shadow work is that recognizing the shadow does not automatically dissolve its grip on behavior in the present moment. A person might become fully aware that their harsh internal criticism toward themselves is actually an inherited voice from a demanding parent. Name it precisely and accurately in a therapy session, and still hear that exact voice the following week during a minor mistake at work, word for word, as though the naming had changed nothing at all about its power to intrude. This is not evidence the insight was wrong or that the work was somehow performed incorrectly, a common conclusion that only adds shame on top of an already difficult process. It is evidence that insight and integration are two entirely different processes operating on two entirely different timelines, and self-awareness only guarantees you access to the first one, never a shortcut straight to the second. The person expecting immediate behavioral change the moment a pattern gets named is setting themselves up for a specific kind of disillusionment that has nothing to do with whether the self-awareness itself was genuine or thorough enough. Lesson 3. The isolation of seeing what others cannot see in themselves. Once a person develops real self-awareness, something shifts in how they experience other people's blind spots, and this shift is rarely comfortable to live inside, no matter how much the person values the growth that produced it. A pattern that took years of deliberate, often painful work to recognize in yourself suddenly becomes visible in others almost instantly, sometimes within minutes of meeting someone new. And the temptation to name it for them, to offer the insight that costs you so much to earn, runs directly into the reality that unearned insight rarely lands the way earned insight does for the person receiving it. Jung noted that psychological development tends to isolate a person somewhat from their previous social environment, not because the aware person becomes superior in any meaningful sense, but because shared unconsciousness had been quietly doing a lot of the social bonding work all along. And once that shared blindness has gone on one side of a relationship, the dynamic between two people changes, whether either party wants it to or not. Picture watching a close friend repeat an obviously self-destructive pattern in their relationships, recognizing the exact mechanism, because you spent 2 years dismantling the identical mechanism in yourself, and having to sit quietly through conversation after conversation where they describe the pattern as bad luck or the wrong choice of partner, unable to offer the insight because insight offered before someone is ready for it tends to produce defensiveness rather than gratitude. Closing. The exact door was meant to open. This produces a specific and rarely discussed loneliness. Being able to see clearly while surrounded by people who cannot yet see what you see, and having to hold that clarity largely alone because sharing it prematurely tends to damage the relationship rather than help the other person move forward on their own timeline, in their own time, in their own way. Lesson 4. watching yourself live instead of simply living. There is a particular trap self-awareness can produce if it goes unchecked over time, a state where the observing mind becomes so active that it starts crowding out ordinary spontaneous experience entirely, leaving very little room for anything to simply happen without commentary. A person deep in this state can no longer simply enjoy a moment, because some part of their attention is permanently occupied analyzing why they're enjoying it, what pattern the enjoyment might be serving, whether the reaction is authentic or simply another inherited script running quietly on autopilot in the background. Jung himself warned against exactly this kind of excessive introspection, recognizing that psychological insight was meant to serve life rather than replace it entirely, and that a person who spends all their energy observing their own machinery eventually has very little energy left over to actually live inside the machine they've spent so much effort studying. Picture someone at a genuinely joyful family gathering, laughing at something funny, and simultaneously running a background analysis of whether that laughter is real connection or performance learned in childhood to keep the peace. The analysis itself quietly draining the actual experience of joy even as it happens in real time, turning a lived moment into a specimen under glass. This is a specific paralysis over analysis produces. A person so busy studying their own reactions that the reactions themselves stop being fully felt, trapped in the observer's seat, when they meant only to visit it occasionally for genuine insight, rather than move in permanently and never leave that seat again. Lesson 5. Turning the weight into something usable. Everything covered so far describes real costs, and none of them should be minimized or explained away as simply a phase to push through quickly on a way to some easier, permanently resolved state. But Jung's actual body of work was never an argument against self-awareness itself. It was an argument for integration, the specific and often slow process of taking everything self-awareness reveals and actually weaving it into a functioning identity rather than leaving it as a permanent, exhausting surveillance operation running on top of ordinary life indefinitely. The difference between a person crushed by self-awareness and a person genuinely transformed by it usually comes down to one specific shift, moving from constant self-monitoring toward periodic, deliberate self-reflection instead, on a schedule the person actually controls. This means the pattern gets checked in on regularly rather than watched every single moment of every single day. The shadow material gets worked within dedicated periods rather than narrated continuously throughout an ordinary afternoon, and moments of genuine spontaneous living get deliberately protected from the analytical mind's constant intrusion, guarded almost the way you'd guard anything else worth protecting. A person who has done this well can still notice, during that same family gathering, a flicker of the old pattern rising to the surface, and instead of either suppressing the awareness entirely or letting it hijack the entire moment, they can simply notice it briefly, file it away for later reflection, and return their attention to the actual laughter happening in front of them right now. This is not less aware than the person trapped in constant analysis. It is more skillfully aware, awareness used as a tool that gets picked up deliberately when needed rather than a lens permanently welded over both eyes at all times. Lesson 6. Self-awareness and the question of other people's readiness. There is a specific ethical dimension to this weight that Jung's work touches on, but rarely gets discussed directly, which is what a self-aware person owes to people around them who are not yet at the same stage of their own process. This is not simply about restraint or holding your tongue politely. It is about recognizing that insight delivered before someone has built the internal capacity to hold it tends to function less like a gift and more like an injury, regardless of how accurate the insight actually is or how well-intentioned delivery might be. A person who has done real work on her own defensiveness can watch a sibling react with total denial to feedback that seems, from the outside, completely obvious and easy to accept, and the temptation is to conclude the sibling is simply unwilling to grow. Jung's framework suggests something more precise is happening, that the sibling psyche has not yet built the scaffolding required to hold that particular piece of information without collapsing into shame or full-scale denial as a protective measure. Picture a person newly aware of how their own criticism of others often masks unprocessed insecurity in themselves, watching a close friend do the exact same thing in conversation about a mutual acquaintance, recognizing the mechanism instantly and clearly, and having to make a genuine choice in that moment between naming it plainly and simply letting the moment pass without saying a word about what they can now see so clearly. This is one of the quieter burdens of real self-awareness, holding accurate insight about someone else and choosing, deliberately and often repeatedly, not to weaponize it or even offer it. Because the goal was never to prove how much you can now see in other people around you. The goal was always your own integration first, and other people's timing is simply not yours to control or accelerate on their behalf. Regardless of how clearly you can now see what they cannot yet see in themselves, no matter how much it costs you to stay quiet about it. Everything covered today comes down to a single truth Jung returned to across decades of his own difficult, often painful work. Self-awareness is not a finish line you cross once and then simply enjoy the view from the other side, done for good and never revisited. It is a weight you learn to carry differently over time, sometimes heavier in certain seasons than others, and the goal was never to become a person who feels nothing uncomfortable about their own patterns anymore. The goal was always integration, a self spacious enough to hold the discomfort of seeing clearly without being crushed underneath it or driven into permanent, exhausting self-surveillance. If today's video named something you've been carrying quietly without a name for it, that alone is worth something. Because naming the weight correctly is the first real step toward learning how to actually carry it well, rather than being crushed under the weight of something unnamed. This channel exists to keep giving you the real mechanics behind psychological growth, past the shallow advice that sells self-awareness as pure liberation without ever mentioning the cost that comes attached to it. Quietly, in the fine print nobody reads until they're already living inside it. If today's video gave you something worth sitting with, do 3 things right now before you move on with your day, none of which take more than a moment of your attention. Like this video, so more people quietly struggling with the way of their own clarity have a real chance to find it exactly when they need it, possibly on a day that feels heavier than they can explain to anyone around them. Share it with someone you know who has been doing real inner work and seems exhausted by it lately. Someone who might need to hear that the exhaustion itself is not a sign they're doing something wrong, but a sign the work is actually real. Subscribe to this channel right now, because the next video goes even deeper into exactly how Jung believed a person moves from painful awareness into genuine, lasting integration, a process that takes longer than most people expect and asks more patience than most people are prepared to give it. Drop this in the comments before you go so it stays with you, something worth returning to on the days it's needed most. I see clearly, and I am learning to carry it. This was never meant to be entertainment you watch once and forget on your way to something else. It was meant to name a weight you may have been carrying alone, quietly, for longer than you realized, and remind you that carrying it is not the same thing as being broken by it. I will see you in the next one.